All right, in today's explainer, we're going to tackle a really influential theory about how the news we see gets made. It's called the propaganda model, and it all kicks off with a pretty fascinating puzzle.
So think about this for a second. How can propaganda, systematic, biased information, really take hold in a society that has a free press, where there's no official government censor literally telling journalists what they can and can't print? It feels like that shouldn't be possible, right? Well, that's the exact contradiction the authors of this model wanted to figure out.
And to get to the bottom of that puzzle, two scholars, Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, came up with what they called the propaganda model. It's basically a framework, a way of looking at the media to understand how it can be technically free, but still end up pushing a line that benefits powerful interests.
Now, the core idea here is really powerful. The model says we shouldn't think of news as just a clear window looking out at the world. Instead, imagine it's more like raw material, like crude oil, that has to go through a whole series of filters that strain and shape it before it ever gets to you.
Yeah, there's a key quote from the source that just nails this idea. The raw material of news must pass through successive filters, leaving only the cleansed residue fit to print. So news gets processed, it gets refined, and what we end up seeing is the final product, the cleansed residue.
So what are these filters? Well, the model lays out 5 of them, and they all work together to shape what we read and watch. We're going to walk through each one so we can see exactly how this whole thing is supposed to work. And here they are: ownership, advertising, sourcing, Flak, and ideology. You can think of this as our roadmap. The first 2 are really all about the economics of media, and the next 3 deal more with things like influence, pressure, and the general climate of opinion. So let's start with those first 2, which are all about the money. Because according to this model, if you really want to understand the news, you have to start with the business structure it's all built on.
The very first filter is ownership, and the point here is pretty straightforward. You can't just start a major TV network or a national newspaper in your basement anymore. It takes an absolutely massive amount of money. And what that means is that the media outlets we all know are owned by huge, profit-driven corporations.
And the scale we're talking about is just staggering. When the model was first put together, the median assets of the top 24 media companies were over $2.5 billion. These aren't just news companies, they are corporate giants, woven into the very fabric of the economy. And that connection goes all the way up to the boardroom. The model points to data like this showing that the people on the boards of these media giants are often the same people on the boards of major banks and other corporations, or their former government officials. The argument is that this naturally creates a shared way of looking at the world, a common set of interests. Okay, so you have these massive corporations. That's step 1. Now, building right on top of that is the second filter, advertising. And this is a really, really critical piece of the puzzle. The model argues that for mass media, the main customer isn't you, the person reading the article. The main customer is the advertiser who's paying to get your attention.
This quote really drives home the power dynamic here. It says advertisers have a de facto licensing authority. What does that mean? It means if a media company can't get big advertisers to buy space, it's probably going to die. It doesn't matter how many readers it has. So, in a way, advertisers have this quiet veto power over who gets to survive in the media world.
And this all creates what the model calls an advertising subsidy effect. Here's how it works. Media that gets a lot of ads can afford to sell their newspaper or magazine for cheaper. They can spend more on flashy graphics and big features. And they can specifically target the wealthier audiences that advertisers love. This puts outlets that rely on their readers for money at a massive disadvantage, often pushing them to the sidelines or just straight out of business.
Okay, so we've looked at the big economic filters, ownership and advertising. Now let's switch gears and look at the next set of filters. These are more about where the media gets its raw material, its information, and the kinds of pressure that can shape how that information gets presented. The third filter is all about sourcing. Think about it. News organizations have this enormous, hungry beast to feed every single day. They need a constant, reliable flow of news. So where do they get it? Well, the model says they overwhelmingly get it from official sources: the government, the Pentagon, corporate PR offices. Why? Because those places are set up to provide a steady, easy-to-digest stream of information, day in and day out. And the imbalance here is just wild. Look at this. The Pentagon has billions of dollars and thousands of people working on public information. Compare that to a small nonprofit peace group. It's not even a contest.
This massive difference in resources means that official sources can basically subsidize the news-gathering process for journalists, making them the easy go-to source.
All right, so let's say a story that's critical of a powerful company or a government policy somehow makes it through those first three filters. What happens then? Well, that's where the fourth filter, Flak, comes into play.
So what is Flak? It's basically organized, weaponized negative feedback. We're not talking about a handful of angry letters to the editor here. We're talking about threats of lawsuits, campaigns to get advertisers to pull their ads, and huge PR efforts to discredit a journalist or a news outlet. The goal is to make certain kinds of reporting just too painful and expensive to even attempt.
And the source material argues this is no accident. Entire organizations, what it calls flak machines, have been created for the specific purpose of generating this kind of pressure. They watch the media constantly, ready to pounce whenever they see coverage that steps out of line with their worldview. And that brings us to the fifth and final filter, ideology. Now, when the model was written, the authors pointed to anti-communism as this overarching national belief system. It was the ultimate control mechanism. You could frame almost anything in terms of fighting a common enemy, and it made it incredibly easy to marginalize anyone who dissented as being unpatriotic or even dangerous.
So there you have it, the 5 filters: ownership, advertising, sourcing, Flak, and ideology. When you put them all together, what kind of world does it create in the news? The model argues it creates a very divided, very black and white picture of the world.
And a key example of this is what the model calls the difference between worthy and unworthy victims. Here's the idea. When people are hurt by an official enemy, their stories get tons of coverage. It's emotional, it's human, it's detailed. But the model claims when people are hurt by our own country or its allies, they become unworthy. Their stories get minimal coverage, very little human detail, and they quickly disappear.
So this whole process doesn't just block certain stories. It also creates the perfect conditions for what the model calls propaganda campaigns. This is when the media system altogether focuses intensely on one story, like the downing of that Korean airliner, KAL-070, because that story happens to perfectly align with the interests of the powerful.
And all of that brings us to our final thought. Now, of course, the propaganda model is just that. It's a model, a theory. It's a way of looking at things. But it leaves us with a really powerful question to ask ourselves. Whether you agree with all of it or just parts of it, how might a framework like this change the way you read, watch, and think about the news every single day? Something to chew on. Thanks for joining me.